Welcome to the Imaginaries.
Hello there, and welcome to another episode of the Imaginaries podcast, where we join with us on a kind of bi-weekly basis, and we talk about science fiction and fantasy and weird, and we welcome you to another episode with us. Today's episode, we are going to be talking all about Orientalism in science fiction and fantasy, as well as how you can counter Orientalism with science fiction and fantasy. We're going to cover a lot. It's 45 minutes, and we are going to give you the equivalent of a really enjoyable graduate seminar in science fiction, fantasy, Orientalism in those 45 minutes.
Oh, God.
So, hold on to your self. I was trying to decide where to go with that.
Horses, your britches,
your ankle
panties?
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. Anyway, so let's talk Orientalism.
Yes.
We are going to, right straight off the bat, talk about what we mean when we say Orientalism. But before we do that, before we define the term that defines our podcast, let's talk about what the Orient is. Where's the Orient in Orientalism coming from?
Well, first I'd like to point out that we aim for 45 minutes with every episode, and yet we have yet to make it in under the wire, ever. So we're going to try. This is one of my passion projects that I've been wanting to talk about on the podcast for a while, simply because this keeps cropping up in critical conversations about science fiction and fantasy on Twitter, in good places, by good people that we trust and admire and respect. You know, think Nydia Korfer, think N.K. Jemisin. So when we talk about Orientalism, we're talking about something that's kind of deeply uncomfortable and messy and hard, and yet there's something about it that also really deserves the scrutiny. So we're going to try and get into what makes it that. So when we use the term the Orient or Orientalism on this podcast, I want to note that we're talking about it within the context of a literary criticism conversation, like when we're going to talk about what other people mean by the Orient. So what has traditionally been meant by the Orient is East. And East as like opposed to the West with a capital W, the East with a capital E. And this is, of course, defined by Westerners with capital W's. So it's east of medieval Europe, essentially. But that's kind of shifted. So Orientalism and the Orient today, it persists. These problems, these issues in literature persist. And where the Orient, and there's big air quotes around that, resides today is a little bit different from where it has historically resided. But historically, you could include everything from Arab cultures and societies, Far Eastern cultures and societies, including the Chinese, and Northern African cultures and societies, including like Morocco, and so on and so forth, within the Orient. So I find that a little hilarious because like Morocco is directly south of Europe and medieval Europe, but you know, they didn't have a great sense of geography back then. So they referred to this whole region, which isn't even like one region, it's like a million regions, but they lumped them together and said, you are the other, you are exotic, you are far away, you are the Orient. So that's what the Orient was and somewhat is today. And it also begs the question, like, is the term useless now because it's so generic? And we'll get into some of the other sort of implications of that, I think, later. But that's kind of what historically the term has meant, at least in the literature that I've been reading.
So if that is the Orient and what the Orient has traditionally been, then what is Orientalism?
So Orientalism is representation of those cultures and societies in capital W Western literature, including science fiction, fantasy. And usually that representation is because it's lumping together all of those regions and all of those cultures without actually having direct firsthand like interaction with them or coming from that place. Like these are not hashtag own voices narratives that are implementing Orientalism. It's representation of Arabian, Far Eastern, Northern African cultures and societies using stereotypes in a way, and I know there's a quote floating around somewhere in our notes, but it's stereotyped in a way that is essentially embodying colonialist or post-colonialist attitudes, both of which are problematic. Yes. So that's kind of like the very summary version. And a lot of the conversation has been shaped by this like monolithic literary criticism text from the 70s by Edward Said, and it was just called Orientalism. And so he kind of broke down how European political ideology sort of manufactured this notion of the Orient and Orientalism in order to kind of, I wouldn't say subvert, but like definitely put these cultures in a literary sense under the heel of European morality and sensibility. So by defining the East as the opposite of the West, and the West is kind of like the home of all things good and pure and Christian, that others and alienates like all of these and exotifies all of these cultures that have been lumped together under the Orient. So yeah, I mean, it's generalizing, it's misrepresenting, it's stereotyping, and we have historically loved the shit out of this stuff. Like, it's everywhere in European and Western literature. It's everywhere in American literature. I mean, if you grew up loving Aladdin, I hate to break it to you, but you fucking ate that shit up. So I want to point out that any story or text can be complex. It can be fucked up in a lot of ways. Like, it can be rife with Orientalism, and it can also have like strong good things in it. But Orientalism, in my opinion, is going to always be a bad thing.
So we've talked before in some dedicated podcasts about the monstrous and about the alien, and we had an entire podcast devoted to spiders, and so we considered both the monstrous and the alien. So if we were trying to distinguish between what casting something as monstrous or alien and casting something as Oriental or as part of Orientalism, where do you think, how are those things different?
That's a good question. And I would note that when it comes to the monstrous and the alien, like, science fiction and fantasy has by and large found ways to kind of reclaim those modes or depictions from the negative. Like, kind of like Yankee Doodle used to be insulting, but now it's like a battle cry.
Yeah, right.
So, like, the monstrous can be a very cool thing now to have, like, Theodora Goss's European Travels for Monstrous Gentlewomen. Like, the monstrous is actively being reclaimed from negative perceptions, even though, like, it still persists. Like, these women are still being embraced as monstrous. They're still being depicted as monstrous, but that's being rendered positive. The same is true in a lot of ways of the alien, although the alien is often, I don't know, the alien can go both ways, the monsters can go both ways. Orientalism really is usually negative in its connotations. So it hasn't been reclaimed. I'm not sure that you even want to touch that with a 10-foot pole, like the concept of reclaiming Orientalism. Maybe the way to reclaim it, which we'll talk about more later, is to have like own voices, authors writing more text from their perspectives and their worldviews and their experiences, and just to have like white Westerners like butt the hell out. I don't know. But there is a relationship between the monstrous and the alien and Orientalism, in that I guess Orientalism probably predates most science fiction, or maybe it's contemporary with the origins of science fiction. It's a very old form of othering. You can probably find significant traces of Orientalism in Homer, you know, all the way back to the ancient Greeks and their perspectives of the East, and the development of Western culture, like the industrialization, all of these things coincided with the opening of the East, or opening of trade routes with the East. So that happens in Marco Polo's time. It happens during the European Industrial Revolution, when these doors are opened to the Far East. You know, whether it's the tea, what do you call them? Tea war? Do you call them tea wars? The tea smuggling things?
Yeah, I think tea wars is very appropriate.
We'll call it the tea wars. So there have been these times when the East has kind of interacted more robustly with Western, capital W, Western cultures. And in those moments, you see like huge bursts of this Orientalism coming to the fore, both in incredibly negative depictions, like, I don't even want to like use their terminology, but you'll have people of Chinese extraction described in Western texts as being animalistic, primitive, and maybe even rapacious, and sort of, they're sexually charged in disturbing ways. You'll find also the noble savage ideal kind of ensconced in there too, where you'll have like individuals who are esteemed but usually meet tragic fates. So it's contemporary with the development of science fiction, maybe predates it by a long spell, but it finds a very happy home in science fiction and fantasy, which is why it's a conversation we're having today. Like, why are we still talking about Orientalism? Because it's still there, and modern science fictional and fantastical texts are being Orientalist in their approach to culture, and it's worth talking about. Anyway, that was very rambly. I'm sorry.
No, that was great. So you wrote in our show notes a short little sentence that stuck with me as I have been looking through these again. Your sentence was, "It," referring to Orientalism, "is recursive rather than creative." And that really stuck with me, I think, because of the article you had sent me earlier today. This article is called "Incredible Geographies, Orientalism and Genre Fantasy" by Miles Balfe. It appeared in Social and Cultural Geography, Journal of Geography, in 2004. And it reminded me of, at the end of that article, in the conclusion, Balfe says, "As we have seen, fantasy texts often problematically draw upon pre-existing, in the case of this paper, Orientalist, cultural discourses to construct their incredible geographies." So basically what that's saying to me is the sort of crazy imaginative things that fantasy authors can do, in the case of this paper, but also science fiction as well, tends to not be that fantastic a lot of the time, and instead relies upon misinformation, Orientalist thinking,
or like
racism,
or like the easy reach, right?
Yeah,
like,
which is a great way to put that. Yeah, just the easiest reach, which is sort of trying to access this Orientalist notion of what XYZ is, and therefore putting it in your book or your show or your movie or something in order to access that knowledge. So I just said a lot, but back to your what you said.
I love that. I love that you loved what I said, so I'm just gonna revel in that a little bit.
Well, that's what I'm going back to. So Orientalism being recursive rather than creative.
Yeah.
Like, was what I just said and what I quoted, is that, kind of what you were thinking about that? Tell me more about recursive versus creative.
Absolutely. And in your texts, in your PhD project, you use the language of like recursiveness and reifying on a regular basis. And I think that it applies here too. There is something that dovetails beautifully about geographical understandings of the world and fantastical understandings of the world. And this article that you just discussed is a great example of how, like, fantasy is dependent on reality just as much as reality is dependent on fantasy. And in the case of Orientalism, Orientalism is the product of the West trying to define itself by creating an other and using that other as a platform for self-definition. Like, that thing is not me, therefore these other things are me. And usually in Orientalism, it's like a moralistic framework. There's often like visual elements to it. Like I mentioned earlier, the connections between the animalistic and the diminishing characteristics or the treatments of quote unquote Oriental cultures in fantasy. All of this is to say, in the real world, the West looked at the East, the Orient, in its mind and said, oh, I need to feel more secure in myself, or maybe they weren't saying this, but they were definitely doing this. I need to feel more secure in myself, and I need to feel justified in the ways in which I already treat others who I don't like. Therefore, I will fantasize about this mythical other, this mythical monstrous, this mythical exotic. And because those things exist out there where I can't possibly have experienced them, I have the freedom to do whatever I want with that image. And therefore, like, it's recursive. It allows itself to create itself. Orientalism allows the West to misbehave and continue misbehaving in miscasting other cultures. It's such an easy reach. It is the laziest way to go when it comes to any sort of cultural norm, whether or creation, whether we're talking about social engineering, civic engineering, or literature, like fantasy. And then fantasy, of course, is dependent on like the social norms and the cultural understandings of the time, just as much as reality, requires fantasy in order to make itself. So that's all I meant.
So there's one big question that I have left for you before we go into more detail regarding some examples of Orientalism from science fiction and fantasy. And my big question is Orientalism racism? Or rather, how are they different? So we've seen how treatments of the alien and the monstrous have some overlap with Orientalism. But by calling things Orientalist, are we just saying that these works are racist?
That is such a good question, and I'm glad you got there. There are going to be some people who push back and say, no, I mean, there's the Venn diagram thing going on, whatever. I would fall on the side of saying, yes, Orientalism is racist in that Orientalism and racism depend upon the same commonly accepted institutions that allow us to misbehave and act out racial oppression. Orientalism may seem harmless, but it comes from the same root as mocking people at rallies, as misbehaving on internet forums and Twitter. The freedom and the permission to cast other people how you see fit, whether or not you actually have real experience with them. It's the same root, in my opinion. But I'd be curious to hear what you think as well.
I agree with you. I mean, I didn't ask that as a leading question. I asked it because I think that there can be a kind of faux barrier between saying, well, this is Orientalist and that's okay because it's just engaging with tropes, as opposed to racism, which is actively engendering harmful stereotypes and reinforcing racist notions of what certain groups and communities are like. I think that calling Orientalism racism is a good place to start, and sort of by recasting it as such, it helps to illustrate, for me at least, why Orientalism is so damaging and why it is, why it isn't something we should be playing around with anymore in science fiction and fantasy, because science fiction and fantasy of late has really done a lot to distance itself from its Orientalist years. And I mean, that's not to say that every work in science fiction coming out now is not Orientalist. Or on the other hand, that because it has an Orientalist past, that we should ditch it forever. Because if that was true, we'd be ditching everything forever. But, what we have come out and what we're going to get to in a few minutes are some of those works that are kind of countering Orientalism and showing that science fiction and fantasy have a really important part to play in, really embracing the hashtag on Voices movement and showing that the fantastical can actually be fantastic and not just Orientalist.
Right. And I think we're going to get to this question at the end of the podcast, but I kind of want to plant the seed now as we prepare to dive into specific examples. But my question would be, how do authors who are not hashtag own voices authors embrace healthy tellings, healthy diversification of their written works, or maybe not written, maybe cinematic, their creations, how do they embrace healthy diversity without crossing a line into cultural appropriation and or Orientalism? So just to kind of plant that thought, we're kind of headed there, hopefully.
Yeah.
And again, like, that's totally selfish of me, but like, I'm not from any of the cultures we've mentioned above. I am extremely white. I glow in the dark white, and I want to do better, and I want to be better, and I want to be part of the movement that makes it safe and makes room for own voices, narratives, and yet, like, I also want to write, and so how do I do my own writing and boost the voices of other authors, et cetera, et cetera. That's where we're going.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about some examples of works that have or are Orientalist in science fiction fantasy.
Sure.
And what I want to say about a bunch of these examples is that they're older. They're from works that have been around for decades and decades, and potentially even longer than that. And part of the difficulty here is that some works can age into Orientalist thought, like as cultures and societies, as concepts of what is okay and what isn't move on, then what was never fine to begin with, grantedly, can be rightfully seen as, well, this was a problem, and now we have the vocabulary and the social consciousness that we need to talk about that. So a lot of these will be older works, but we do have some newer works as well to show how this kind of thing is still fairly common, because I will certainly be quoting from some very popular works that have come out in the last 10 years. But let's start with, well, where do you want to start? What example?
I want to start with Katy Perry.
Okay, let's just let's dive right in.
And I think Katy Perry is a great stand-in for like a bunch of live performance artists, musicians, etc., who have taken Orientalism and fed it into their costumes, their set design, their aesthetic. And in the case of some performers, like, some performers actually are from those cultures, therefore it's okay for them to use it. But for someone like Katy Perry, whose music videos, whose songs are pretty much the soundtrack for every dystopian or utopian film of the present day. Her songs are basically anthems that kids, sing at rallies and marches. Like, Katy Perry's voice and these other artists' voices are voices of protest, of the future, of making a future. And so for her and other artists to embrace Orientalism feels kind of dirty and underhanded and unnecessary. It's all pageantry to these artists. It's not real. They're not really trying to evoke deliberately any sense of the East, or at least so they say. And I mean the historical East, and I mean air quotes around the Orient, etc. But like, you look at their costumes and they are fully dependent on Oriental aesthetics. So anyway, all of this to say, when you watch a Katy Perry music video, and I highly recommend that you do, Tony. I mean, surely you've heard her songs somewhere, like in an airport.
Well, yeah, I've definitely heard some Katy Perry. I've definitely heard some Katy Perry songs, but I've never seen a Katy Perry music video.
Okay, I feel like you should. I mean, some of them are just fine, but like a good chunk of them are not just fine. and specifically not fine in that they embrace Orientalism as an aesthetic, and as an aesthetic that is completely separated from any true root in these cultures, and so on and so forth. So Katy Perry is a great example of like breaking everything that you said earlier about text being older, and it being like part of the storied past of science fiction and fantasy. Katy Perry is living and breathing today, and she's not the only one. Like, it's a part of performance today. Anyway, that's all I have to say about that. I like some Katy Perry songs, but I do not like the aesthetic.
That is fine. You need feel no shame for liking some Katy Perry songs. But I also want to share... I also want to bring up something that is fairly modern, and that is Avatar by James Cameron, and also The Last Airbender
by
M. Night Shyamalan.
Oh my god.
The movie.
The worst.
Both of those, because I want to then, in a minute, turn around and praise both Avatar The Last Airbender and The Legend of Korra, the TV shows, as being positive representations in science fiction and fantasy. But both Avatar, the James Cameron movie, and The Last Airbender, the movie. It's important.
Wait,
it's
we're
important
talking about
to
blue aliens and...
Yes, they are.
Gotcha.
Yes, they are. They both rely so much on what's unspoken about what, quote, the Orient, unquote, is like for their particular universes. In Avatar, the James Cameron movie, there is a lot of fast and loose playing with what Native and Aboriginal peoples do, with the sort of like magical and mystic powers that they are supposed to have, with, it's down to, I don't know, just, I don't particularly like that movie for a lot of reasons. But I think it's a really great example of how that kind of Orientalism is still really present in works that can be extremely popular.
Yeah.
Because that movie made God knows how much money.
We're talking about James Cameron again?
We're talking about James Cameron, yeah. And there are 17 sequels that are greenlit, even though it came out 10 years ago.
Theme park.
And a theme park.
They have a theme park. Fucking theme
right,
park.
but it's all built around this sort of pseudo-fantastic world. There are parts of it that are really fantastic, and I will not deny that the movie is really pretty to look at. Floating islands, the wildlife. I just like alien animals.
Yeah, but they use papyrus
on
font,
screen.
which pretty much kills them
right,
in my book.
But they use... we can have a whole conversation about fonts in film and book. But anyway, it's relying a lot upon those Orientalist tropes as far as Native peoples are concerned. On the other hand, you have the Last Airbender movie, which was not successful, which was commercially and critically a complete failure, as it deserved to be because it was terrible. But whereas the series, both Avatar: The Last Airbender and The Legend of Korra, the series, built really immersive worlds, or built a really immersive world between the two series that was both reinforced by the real world but didn't rely upon Orientalist tropes to bring those real world references in. On the other hand, the movie, The Last Airbender, decided it would be a great idea to cast all white actors as the heroes and cast the entire Fire Nation with Indian actors. And it was just such a bizarre choice to kind of take what was really foundational to the series and was really artfully and intelligently and thoughtfully explored over the course of the 7 seasons of both Avatar: The Last Airbender and The Legend of Korra, and just boil it down to stereotypes.
Yeah, but see, here's the thing about Orientalism. It's not bizarre when you are immersed in that worldview.
Right.
It's not bizarre to typecast the entire set of baddies as a racialized group of people. Or a sexualized group of people, as is often the case.
Right.
So that's the sneaky thing about Orientalism, is that when you don't buy into it, then it seems bizarre and weird and fucking annoying. But when you're immersed in it, that shit is your brain candy, and that shit is that's the expected norm. So I go all the way back to Aladdin. And Walt Disney is problematic in so many ways, but classic Disney movies, including Aladdin, they rely on easy reaches and visual shorthand for things. And Aladdin, more so than most, although Pocahontas definitely went there too. Actually, every single one went there. That whole decade of Disney movies, from The Lion King to Pocahontas to Mulan, we love these movies and they are our brain candy. But when we shut our brains off about cultural norms and cultural appropriation and so on and so forth. So again, like, there's good things about those films. There's nothing good about the Last Airbender movie, but there's like good things about Disney. But there's also some really shitty things. And that's what's sneaky and annoying about Orientalism, is that when your brain is turned on to it, all these things that you love for sometimes good reasons also have this dark side to them. And it's worth noting that I don't want to hate too hard on Disney, because I also really, really love Mulan, and I really, really love The Lion King, and Elton John, Belton music. I mean, come on. That is like brain candy right there. But again, I enjoy it best when I shut my brain off and I don't engage with it critically, thinking about this question and this conversation. And there are times when you need to shut your brain off, but we've kind of been shutting our brains off a little bit too often historically in science fiction and fantasy when it comes to this conversation. So a couple of other texts that we have on our list. We want you guys listening to fight us on these if you want to. I would postulate another one that breaks your sort of old golden age definition or boundary line, and that would be Habibi by Craig Thompson, which is a graphic novel, and it's relatively recent. It's like definitely last decade. And this is something that I reviewed on Goodreads at length with scathing anger. So if you want the review, like, go to my Goodreads page. But the summary version is that Thompson takes the visual language of Arabic art, and he takes characters that are set in something very similar to the Arabian Desert, or one of the Arabian deserts, and he pulls out harems, he pulls out all the visual stylistic elements, the cultural stereotypes, everything that would be considered Orientalist, and shoves it on the page, and it's beautiful. Like, it's, artistically speaking, it's incredible. Orientalism is everywhere, though. It's like every element of that book is Orientalist, and it is so deeply problematic. Underlying all of it was this assumption of the exotic and the other, and it was romanticizing it just as much as it was relying on the negative stereotypes, which is a really heady mix. It's like sweet and salty popcorn. You know, like you eat that shit up because it goes so well together. And
peanut butter pretzels.
Oh yeah, and like you have to turn your brain off to enjoy any of these carbs, Tony. Anyway, that would be my next postulation. Did you have any other texts?
Well, we've said so much about older things and then said all new things. So I want to go back and call out some of the big monoliths from science fiction and fantasy, like Dune, like Wheel of Time. You added in Lord of the Rings.
I did.
And I think there's going to be so much out there about Dune, about Wheel of Time. But tell me more about where your Orientalist criticism of Lord of the Rings comes from.
All right. So imagine you have a world in which the good guys are, like, in terms of, like, the various good guy cultures, are all rooted in Western European cultures. Irish, Welsh, Scottish, English, like British English. All of these inflections, when you find them in a culture in Middle-earth, whether linguistically or visually, like the flowing blonde locks of the Recursive are very much, like, Viking-ish. Those cultures are good. Like, the entire cultural group is good, unless it has been perverted by, like, some irresistible dark force. Then, in the same world, you take all of the bad guy groups, and you make them people of color. So I'm talking here about the Easterlings, and the Haradrim, and the Southrons, all of whom are employed by is a loose way of describing enslaved by or like brainwashed by, but like they definitely fight for the forces of evil. So all people of color in Middle Earth are evil, essentially, or they are allied with evil forces. Whereas if you have a good guy, like, chances are pretty darn good, unless you're talking about a Peter Jackson movie, that they're white. And even in the Peter Jackson movies, like, they're mostly white. And they're also mostly male, but that's a different conversation. So in Lord of the Rings, there's a lot to love about Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings is like the thing that got me into writing. Thank you, Peter Jackson. Thank you, Tolkien. But they also are deeply rooted in these easy reaches, these lazy cultural appropriations and miscastings that align very, very closely, if not perfectly, with Orientalism. That's why I put Lord of the Rings on the list. It's not that it's a terribly bad, burnable book. It's that it's got that stuff in it that we have to recognize and we have to interrogate.
Right. Yeah, and that's, I mean, everything that you've said has led towards this being especially about works that are older, like a really nuanced conversation. Because, I don't know, I would call Lord of the Rings rightfully a classic, something that has stood the test of time, and yet something that is problematic, given the way that we look at things now. And again, like I said before, that it suddenly didn't become problematic. It's just some of the things culturally, socially, community-wise that were taken for granted once upon a time are no longer taken for granted. And now we can recognize them as being problematic.
And in like 30 seconds, we're going to talk about some texts that have helped kind of change the landscape a little bit. But before we got there, I think we should talk you should talk a little bit about Dune and why you stuck Dune on this list.
I stuck Dune on this list. Because, I mean, pretty much just what you said about Lord of the Rings. Everything can be applied directly to Dune, both in terms of how the native peoples are treated within the book, where their inspiration comes from outside of the book, and how it's aged. So those three important pieces are all present for Dune as well.
Yeah, we've come a long way since Dune.
Yeah.
And you put some great texts on like our list of works that in science fiction and fantasy kind of either attempt deliberately to counter Orientalism or just naturally do so by existing. So tell us a little bit, since I haven't finished it yet, but it's definitely, I have read other works by the author and greatly enjoyed them. Tell us a little bit about Alief the Unseen.
Well, Alief the Unseen is a fairly recent novel from G. Willow Wilson, who is also the writer of Ms. Marvel, Kamala Khan, which...
And a great autobiography.
Yeah. So she has her writing quill dipped in many ink pots, let's say, about G. Willow Wilson. But what attracted me to this in the first place is that years and years ago, I came across a list that said, or that supposed, that a lot of successful, award-winning, and commercially successful modern fantasy can all kind of be traced back to Lord of the Rings, and really comes from that very, like, Western European, Viking-ish derived tradition of this is what high fantasy looks like. And Alief the Unseen had been noted, and I wish I could tell you more about where I read this, or I'm probably conflating like 5 different things. But I remember that Alief the Unseen was cited as a really good example of how to do more contemporary fantasy in a way that doesn't really draw on any Western fantasy tropes at all. And I was like, oh, well, I want to check that out because, encountering something completely new. That sounds cool. And it is that and more. Yeah. It is one of those books that really dances between genres. Like, it is fantasy, it's science fiction, it's doing a lot that's straight up literary fiction, it's a critique of modern times. It's so clever in so many ways. I would recommend it without reservation. But importantly for our episode today, it's doing some things that I had never seen Western treatments of, in this case, Middle Eastern fiction or Middle Eastern-derived cultures and representation of Middle Eastern cultures in fantasy and science fiction try to do. And so it was a complete revelation, and it was completely new for me because I had never encountered that before. It was a total break from Orientalism, a total break from stereotypes and destructive tropes, and it really helped color this world that I was very unfamiliar with.
Well, I think it's the same could be said for several of the other texts that made it onto our list.
Agreed.
And one that I enjoyed greatly was, and you put this on the list, thank you, is the Ten Surrett Series by J.Y. Yang. And this is a series of novellas. I have yet to get my hands on the third one. I'm very excited to do that. This is a series that tackles so many of the issues that we love to see tackled in our science fiction and fantasy. It's got strong characters, it's got strong plot, and it does all of these things and depends not at all on Orientalist worldview. And it does all of these things while set in a world that is very clearly rooted in, I would say several of the cultures that have been lumped together under Oriental. So that's like a series that I was very excited to see you pop on the list. But you had several others on here too.
Yeah, and I want to talk about a couple of them. Maybe not so much at length, but just to give some great recommendations for those who aren't familiar with these works. If you're looking for works that directly, whether intentionally or not, and I think in all of these cases it is intentional, but work to counter Orientalism in science fiction and fantasy, check these out, like Fonda Lee's Jade City, which came out last year, Saladin Ahmed's Throne of the Crescent Moon, which came out a few years ago. I think it's definitely within the last decade.
Yeah, thank you for recommending that one, by the way. I enjoyed that a lot.
Yeah, for sure. And Rebecca Roanhorse's Trail of Lightning, which is actually new this year, and really resonates because it is set locally. Like, its main presence is in what is in the future no longer the United States, but generally the Four Corners area.
Yeah, which brings up an interesting point in that in America, and we mentioned this earlier, in America, the conception of the Orient has always been mixed up with the conception of Native American peoples. And and so to see Trail of Lightning on this list, at first I was like, oh, maybe, yes, definitely. It belongs on this list because it tackles the same issues of exotification and othering and miscasting as the other texts on this list. So I was excited to see that pop on there.
Yeah, and that's actually a really interesting, or rather, I have a really interesting juxtaposition. Because on the one hand, you have this book that came out this year, Trail of Lightning, and I couldn't help, because there are so few representations that I've encountered in science fiction and fantasy of Native Americans. I couldn't help comparing to, from Star Trek Voyager, Chakotay, who is, you could tell that the writers of Voyager really were interested in representation, but kind of just fell back on Orientalist notions of, like, exotic and magical Native Americans who can commune with their spirit guides and follow them into space and do something with their ancestors who are actually aliens. And, like, on the one hand, if there was kind of, like, this intensive and intentional desire to make something that wasn't Orientalism, I think Chakotay could have been a really interesting character, the same way that several other characters from Voyager were handled very well. Note that I'm not saying which characters, because Voyager was such a mixed bag. But on the other hand, you know, when you compare the sort of kind of good intentions, maybe not fully there, still a lot of Orientalism that you see in something like that representation, and compare it to something like Trail of Lightning, you see immediately how Orientalism is, you know, stands in stark contrast to that. Yeah. So one of the other reasons that I would recommend the books that we just named, Alief the Unseen, Jade City, the Ten Surrett Series, Throne of the Crescent Moon, and Trail of Lightning, is that they really, really help to unpack what Orientalism looks like, because they're doing something different.
They are. Absolutely. I think that that's a great list for starting, and if our listeners have any recommendations to add to that list, we're particularly interested in own voices narratives, but we also would love to hear more about how authors who are not own voices authors can get at some of these conversation points in graceful and nuanced ways.
And I am really interested in, you put on this list, our last entry, I had mentioned again Avatar, The Last Airbender, and The Legend of Korra, but I want to talk about your mention of The Matrix.
Yeah, so I have like crazy feelings about The Matrix anyway, because like this movie has been co-opted by, I don't think it's any secret to tell anyone this, it's been co-opted by the far right in America, the political far right, and it's become like a fanboy favorite among neo-Nazis, for lack of a better word, and I find that just so stinking hilarious because it was made by two trans women, and it features a half Asian lead actor, a woman, and a black man as the trio of central good characters. And they are opposed by, actually, several white guys, but the white guy who betrays them, and then the white guy who's been hunting them the whole movie. Those are the bad guys. And so it's very clearly like a flip of the usual Orientalist tropes. Now, it definitely kind of brings in some of the techno-Orientalist aesthetics still, which is, again, like, it complicates things. But it does so much work for the queer community, for representation of actors of color and actors who are women, and it completely butts up against everything that the far right stands for right now, which I think is very interesting. And I think that as far as movies go, there are some other movies that are doing well. And I'm very excited to see Crazy Rich Asians in theaters, for example. That's not fantasy or science fiction, but it might as well be. And there's a lot of pressure on movies like Crazy Rich Asians because they're kind of still very new. Like, they're the only movies featuring primarily Asian casts. And so a lot of pressure is riding on them to do everything perfectly.
Right. And it's actually interesting that you mentioned that, because I read an article that, and what the entire article is not relevant, but the relevant part is that it said that before Crazy Rich Asians, there had been a gap of some number of years that seemed too high since there had been a movie that was led by an all Asian American cast, and that last movie had been The Joy Luck Club, which came out, I'm pretty sure it might have been the late 80s, maybe early 90s, but like that movie is pretty much as old as we are. And I remember seeing that and thinking like, wow, that's really cool that we can have, and this was, I was in college and I was also reading The Joy Luck Club. And I was like, that's awesome that Hollywood would do this. And then there was just nothing until now. Yeah. So that's a long time.
It's like seeing queer people in films. Like, you're like, oh wow, like Transparent exists. And oh my goodness, like first of its kind, it's gonna break new ground, and then crickets, So with Orientalism, breaking the chain is not going to be the work of one lifetime. It's going to be the work of many lifetimes. It's still pretty hard to find them. Going back to our show notes, like one of the questions that we put on there is like, is it easy to find works that counter Orientalism? And it's like, no, still pretty hard. Yeah. Still working on that.
Yeah.
But they're getting there. And there's actually a book that I would point people to that I found on Amazon. It's called Techno-Orientalism, Imagining Asia in Speculative Fiction, History, and Media. And it's put out by Asian American Studies Today, and it features 20 authors who have the right to say what they're saying about this stuff. So I would point people towards texts like that, which at least are offering critical insights into our way through this mess.
Yeah. So maybe to close out, we can finish on those tropes that if they're present, probably some Orientalism going on. So things to look out for as you're, going through your books and your shows and your movies and whatnot. But did you pull this list from somewhere? Because it's actually funny how I looked at this and I was like, yes, this is so accurate.
So
I mean, it's sad. I'm laughing because it's sad, but
the first three did come from somewhere, and it's from one of the several articles that we'll post links to when we put our notes online. But then the rest of them, I was like, oh yeah, I mean, if these three are there, then probably you also have these other three. Very likely. So your book might be Orientalist if it features snake charmers, carpet vendors, veiled women, kohl-rimmed eyes, harems, or dark-skinned people groups being typecast as bad, inferior, or suspicious. So, keep an eye out for that shit, people, and don't do it.
Don't do
it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. So this is our call for, if you have listened this far in this episode, please tag us on Twitter, shoot us an email. We're interested in having a follow-up conversation about this. Which let us know your thoughts.
Which begs the question, Tony, where can you find us?
Where can you find us? Well, our Twitter, which you should, tweet at us. It all sounds so stupid. Twitter. Okay, if you want to go to our Twitter and interact with us there, you can. We are imaginary_pod. We also are online on our website, which is www.imaginaries.net. You can find all of our backlists on YouTube. Just search for The Imaginaries. And you can find our newest episodes on iTunes and SoundCloud. You'll be able to get a fair number of our most recent episodes, maybe over the last couple of months. And finally, if you want to drop us an email, you can definitely do so. And our email address is
imaginarypod@gmail.com. No underscore.
And there you have it.
There you have it.
No underscore. Yeah. So please let us know what you thought. Please share your thoughts with us. I just said the same thing twice, but in a different way. And every time I do that, I think of the Emperor's New Groove. The poison for Cusco. Cusco's poison. The poison specifically meant for Cusco. So
It's deeply problematic. Actually, that
Yeah,
should have been on our list, Tony.
it should have
We
been,
missed an
but
opportunity.
now here we
Oh,
are.
God.
At the end of all things.
No Lord of the Rings references to close out this podcast.
Well, I'm making all the references,
All the
as we're trying to
all
end.
the
So
references.
we will be back again
Yes.
in a couple of weeks. Look out for us then. Until then,
Until then.
bye.